Chapter 6. He looked at her as she walked around the car to the passenger side door. "What do you mean when you say energy?" She climbed into the car before responding. "Exactly that. It's part of the reason I've always liked being around you. That energy was always reassuring and warm." She bounced lightly on the seat as she put on her seatbelt, before scrunching up her nose and continuing. "Now though, it's more like a sugar rush or like I'm drinking a bunch of mom's coffee. It's different. It still feels like you but stronger, more intense. I don't know what to think." As she spoke, he noticed her eyes changing color and streaks of fire engine red spreading through her hair. "Penelope, look into the mirror," he said quietly as he started the car and backed down the driveway. She tilted her head at him in confusion and then lowered the vanity mirror and gasped. "What is happening to me?" she screeched, her eyes fixated on her changing hair. Her eyes had changed from molten caramel to a golden honey during the time she had been in the car. Her hands scrabbled at the door handle as Jack pressed on the brake, not wanting her hurt for what she was about to do. She flung the passenger side door open and ripped off her seatbelt with a cry. Penny tripped and rolled as she ran back towards the house, her feet pounding up the paved driveway. Behind her, Jack threw the car into park and yanked the key out of the ignition as he followed after his panicking sister. "Mom?" Penelope screamed out as soon as the door was open. "Mom?" she called out again as she ran into the house. Eleanor came rushing out of the office at the back of the house, with her husband in tow. Her eyes were wide with panic at her daughter's frantic yells. Clearing the corner, she stopped as she saw her daughter's nearly luminescent eyes and the bright red streaks that now ran through her hair. For a heartbeat, the color seemed to fade, only to surge brighter as Jack ran into the house behind her. His eyes sought out his mother's, unsure of what to say or even do under the circumstances. Jason stood behind his wife and heard her curse softly under her breath. What is going on here?" he asked in exasperation. Eleanor had just told him that she had been keeping a big secret about their son from him. Something that was both life-changing and incredibly dangerous. Now he was finding out she was also keeping a secret about their daughter as well. "I was going to tell you," she whispered quietly before pulling her daughter into her pale and lightly freckled, shaking arms. Jack saw how close his father was to freaking out and knew he needed to take control of the situation. Slamming the front door closed, he grabbed everyone's attention. "Everyone, calm down," he said forcibly. "I'm sorry, Mom, we got into the car and this happened," he told her as he pointed to Penelope's hair. "I pointed it out to her without thinking. I'm sorry I couldn't give you the time you needed to talk through everything." He apologized with a wince, realizing just how badly he had screwed up. The look on his father's face was raw and painful. This might be too much at one time, blindsiding him without giving him the time he needed to work through his feelings properly. Jack swallowed heavily as he saw his father take a step back from his mother and sister, his tortured face going carefully blank. It was not something he had ever seen his father do, shuddering his emotions like that, hiding them away from his family. That single action scared him more than everything else that had happened within the last day. I think I need a few minutes," Jason said, finally brushing past everyone and opening the front door. With a barely stifled cry, Eleanor sank to the ground, still clutching to her confused and scared daughter. Jack hurried forward and clutched at his mother and sister, unsure of what he could do to reassure them that everything would be all right. The front door closed with an ominous click, and what little control his mother had managed to cling to disappeared. Jack could only watch as she buried her face in her daughter's ever-redder hair and began to cry piteously. "Sorry. I did not handle that well." Refusing to let go of his sister and mother, Jack twisted his neck and saw his father facing the now closed door with a bowed head. "Please, Eleanor, stop crying, you know what that does to me," he said softly, stepping away from the door and turning to face them. Nudging his son to the side, he carefully unwound his wife's arms from around their daughter and pulled her into an all-encompassing embrace. Jack reached for his sister and wrapped an arm around her as they watched their parents. Penelope's eyes were still wide, but he could see that the panic that had been in them before had vanished. Seeing their mother lose control like that had temporarily made her forget about her own problem. "Come on, let's leave them for now. They have a lot that they need to talk about, and it would be better if we weren't here for it," he whispered into her ear, noticing that as he did so, the hair there had turned red. "All right," she agreed, pushing him from the room. Her eyes remained fixed on her parents, who had yet to move. Jack let her push him from the room and towards the back of the house, as her finger began to jab into him painfully. He arched his back and took a hurried step forward, twisting around until he could see her. Ow, what was that for? He took a step back, as the look on her face unsettled him. No, it wasn't the look on her face, it was her eyes. In the dim windowless hallway, it was easy to see the glow that suffused them. The angry squint of her eyes mixed with the thin white line of her lips would normally have had him laughing at her. She was too young to be able to pull off that kind of look properly. Right now was anything but ordinary. She looked dangerous. The stance of her body told him how close she was to losing it. Her curled fingers with short but sharp nails promising pain. Her slightly bent legs and forward lean hinting at her intentions. Raising his hands, he stepped back from her and tried to calm her down. "Calm down, Penelope. I'll explain what I can, but I only know what Mom told me this morning. We can't be loud either. If we make too much noise, we'll distract Mom and Dad from talking everything out. Do you want that?" At the mention of their parents, she seemed to deflate as her body sagged and lost the tension that had kept it coiled. The glow of her eyes remained, but the dangerous gleam had left them. It left her looking like what she was, a young girl who was scared of so many things. At the corners of her eyes, he could see the flicker of moisture as she sniffed and rubbed at her suddenly runny nose with the back of her hand. "Into my room," he said quietly. He wanted to comfort her, but he knew that if he so much as reached for her, she would start crying. He hated seeing his sister like this, but he hated seeing her cry even more. She was such a happy girl that her crying always felt wrong to him. She hurried into his room and perched herself on the bed while he sat at his desk. One of his pillows was gripped tightly in her arms with her legs crossed beneath it. He had closed the door behind them so they didn't have to speak so softly. "How bad is it? How badly did Mom mess up?" Penelope's voice was soft and barely carried to his ears as she buried her face into his pillow. "I don't know. I think pretty bad though. I know she was worried about how Dad would take it. I've never seen her that scared to talk to Dad before." "What did she do?" she asked, peeking her eyes out from within the pillow. "She's been hiding the truth about me, and apparently you, from him since our births," he said with a sigh. "What truth? Why would she do that? Did she have an affair?" she spit out in rapid fashion. "No, she did not have an affair," he shot out, shutting down that line of thought right away. He did not want his little sister thinking about their mother like that. "I'm talking about the truth of what we are, what Mom is." Penelope absent-mindedly pulled a lock of her newly red-streaked hair into her mouth as she waited for him to continue. Seeing that he had her full attention, he relaxed into the chair and told her everything his mother had told him at the restaurant. She was silent while he spoke, sucking on her hair in disbelief. It was only when he had finished speaking that she said anything. "I'm not sure what to say right now. Magic is supposed to be fake, not real." She stood and spit the lock of hair from her mouth as she wound herself into a fit. "How could Mom keep something like this from us? Especially me? I can at least somewhat understand her keeping it from you, considering everything that would entail. But it is an entirely different situation when it comes to me." Jack couldn't help but roll his eyes at her reaction. Of course, she would be willing to accept such an outlandish story as truth right away and then make it about herself. It wasn't that she was self-centered or anything, at least no more than anyone else her age. It was just that she was seeing how it affected her, with her eyes and her hair. Actually, he wasn't sure if she had even noticed her eyes yet. In the car, her hair had been more noticeable than the shifting color of her eyes. "Right, and I'm sure that is exactly what Mom was concerned about all these years," he said dryly as she began to pace in front of his bed. She paused to glare at him for a second, and then went back to her pacing. "I want to talk to Mom. How much time do you think they need?" she whined to him as her feet beat out a rhythm on the carpet. "I don't know, but I imagine more time than we have given them at this point. There is a lot that they need to discuss and work through. You saw how close Dad was to walking out earlier." At the mention of what had almost happened, he saw her tense before sinking back onto the bed. He could only imagine just how confused she was feeling right now. Jack stood from the chair and crouched in front of his sister, pulling her into a hug. He could feel her trembling against his chest as she struggled to keep everything inside. "It's all right, just let it go. I'm here for you, and I'm not going anywhere," he whispered to her softly as he stroked her hair. The sound of her sobbing into his chest reached his ears as he felt her tears begin to soak through his shirt. Through it all, he held his little sister close, trying to reassure her that everything would be all right with his presence. Sometime during the midst of her crying, she had slipped from the bed and onto the floor with him. She was quiet and her body still when the door to his room finally opened and his mother peeked her head inside. "How is she doing?" she asked quietly when she saw Penelope curled into his chest. He beckoned her inside with a wave of his head before answering. "I told her what you told me, but honestly, it's a lot to take in." Then there was the thing with Dad and her hair changing colors, plus her eyes now glowing. Although I'm not sure if she knows about that one yet. "Honey, slow down." She interrupted her son from his rambling. "Right." He took in a deep breath and released it slowly. "I think that you need to start whatever training you were going to do with her right away. She needs to feel like she has some control, and you need to talk to her." Eleanor tilted her head as she looked at him. That sounds like an incredibly mature response, and not at all like something you would normally say. This is something important, something that is going to affect her entire life. I can't afford to be flippant about something like that," he said as he squeezed his sister tighter, his eyes growing slightly moist. "How's everything with Dad? Were you able to explain everything to him properly?" She winced as she sat on the floor next to her kids. "He is not happy with me, and I understand why, just like he understands why I did what I did. He holed himself in his office a few minutes ago, after we finished talking. He thought that part of my life was mostly contained to just my work, and now to have it thrust back at him like this, I think really blindsided him. Not to mention me hiding everything about you from him for all these years has him questioning what else I might have been concealing from him." She sighed and seemed to deflate into herself. "It's going to be a long road before he fully trusts me again, but at least he isn't leaving." The air around them had taken on a heavy, dreary quality as she had been speaking, fitting the mood that now filled the small bedroom. "Mom," Jack finally began, looking her in the eye. "What were those monsters last night? I've never seen anything like that around here before." His hand kept stroking his sister's increasingly red hair as she breathed deeply into his chest, asleep and blissfully unaware of the world around her. "I have a few ideas, but I can't be certain without seeing them in person. The description you gave me is worrying. I thought I had removed all the monsters, nightwalkers, and other such beings from this area years ago. There are many monsters in the world that regular people have forgotten about through the years, or just plain never knew existed. Many have been hunted into extinction, but something new always appears to take their place." She sighed and leaned heavily against him. "I haven't been following parts of the world of magic and monsters as closely as I should have been these last few years. Some of the things I knew, and the things I thought I knew, are woefully outdated at this point." Jack could almost feel the despair emanating from his mother as she spoke. "It'll be all right, Mom, all of it. Dad will come around, and I'm sure Penelope will find it exciting as soon as she stops freaking out. And me, I'll meet up with Kaitlyn and her family and start learning about my abilities. Everything is going to be fine. You just wait and see." He wasn't entirely convinced that it would work out like that at all, but it sounded good, and he could feel his mother relaxing next to him at his words. "I hope so." He heard her whisper softly next to him, before straightening and climbing to her feet. "Give me your sister. I'll take her to her room and talk to her there. She and I have several things that we need to talk about, but I'm going to let her sleep for now." Jack readjusted his grip on his sister as he stood next to his mother. The light weight of her sleeping body stirred gently in his arms. His mother took her from his arms and walked out of his room, leaving him alone and with his emotions in flux. Wordlessly, he sank onto his bed and curled into a ball, waiting for sleep to come over him. He had gotten only a couple of hours of sleep that morning, and it had been an emotional roller coaster ever since he had woken. Jack woke with a groan as the alarm on his phone blared hatefully next to his head. It was light outside his window, with the dawning sun hanging just above the horizon. "I need more sleep," he said into his pillow, closing his eyes again, It was Monday, which meant he had school. It also meant that he would see Kaitlyn and her family again. Worse, he had fallen asleep so early yesterday that he had never had a chance to talk to his father or mother again. He only knew what she had told him, which admittedly was something. If she hadn't ended up being some kind of witch or magic user or whatever, then he would be going into this situation even more blind. Regardless, it didn't exactly help him to feel at ease. Punching his pillow, he pushed off his bed and grabbed some clothes before stumbling into the bathroom for a shower. The hot water and steam helped to wake him up, as the chilly air of the bathroom receded for a few moments. He hurriedly pulled on his clothes and ran back to his room for shoes. Penelope would be wanting the shower next, if it wasn't already too late. Jack burst into his room and shoved his feet into his shoes as he grabbed blindly for his wallet and phone. Pulling his bag off his desk, he rushed from his room and stopped in shock when he ran into the kitchen. Sitting calmly at the table was Kaitlyn, talking to his mother. What? What is going on here? He managed to ask in a barely coherent manner. Looking away from the guest sitting in front of her, his mother answered, I woke up early to drive you to school. You mentioned yesterday that you had ridden your bike Saturday night. It was left behind during everything. I thought I would pick it up after dropping you off. Kaitlyn here, apparently, was thinking something similar. Okay. He had completely forgotten about not having his bike. It was how he got everywhere, including to and from school. This is my family's address. I'll see you there after school. It seems that we have more to discuss than we thought. Kaitlyn said somewhat stiffly, as she slipped a piece of paper across the table to Eleanor. I'll meet you both there then, she said, taking the proffered paper.